Hello and welcome to the Informed Animal Ally presented by the Vancouver Humane Society. This is the Animal Ethics Podcast where we share the ins and outs of topics like cruelty, legislation, and advocacy here in BC and across Canada. Hi, I'm Chantal Archambault, Communications Director for the Vancouver Humane Society. Here with me is my co-host, VHS's Executive Director, Amy Morris.
Hello.
This month, we're going to talk about one element that's used in a lot of advocacy work, and that is surveys and polls. We'll be looking at why collecting this kind of data is important, the ways we can use it in our advocacy work, and some examples of how recent surveys from the Vancouver Humane Society are being used. So first, Amy, I was wondering if you could share a little bit about what we're talking about when we discuss survey data, like what kinds of questions are asked and how are those answers useful when we're talking about animal advocacy?
Yeah, there's a lot of different data that can be gathered from surveys. You can learn about what people think. We kind of frame that as public opinion, but that can also take into account, for example, how people feel about their pets, for example. You can also measure public behavior so you can get a sense of what people are actually doing with their time and their money. And then you can gather demographic data. So demographic data gives sort of more context to the polling data. So some examples to go into more depth of these. When you think about what people think, that helps you have a sense of how people are falling on a scale. And when you're trying to shift attitude, when that's your goal, is to change the way people think about things, then you can use that public opinion polling to get a gauge as to whether you've been successful or not. And you can do that on a micro scale with a small community, or, if you're targeting ads and you're really trying to get a sense of what's happening right in Vancouver. Or you can do that where you compare that to a national audience. You can see how much growth has happened based on a campaign and measure that against a whole area that hasn't had that campaign. One example of this is a Research Co survey that asked, would you say you are in favor or opposed to each of the following? Eating animals, using animals in rodeo, killing animals for their fur. And so you can take that data and you can bring it to decision makers, politicians, and business owners when advocating for a change. And that shows what the public opinion is when it comes to a practice that harms animals. And when you look at it that way, it really is the most useful piece of data for the government because they don't necessarily care directly about animals. They care about what the people who vote for them think. And really, that data tends to be the most useful. Other polling data, such as public behaviors, how people act and behave, it can be useful for decision makers as well. However, it has sort of a different effect. An example is a survey about people's eating habits and dietary choices, or a question about if you've been to the zoo in the past year. So if people are eating less meat on their own, we can bring that to a city to say, as they're creating their food budget, they could make more accessible plant-based options available in their parks because we have evidence that people are eating less meat and wanting to eat more plant-based food available. When it comes to the demographic data, it really helps give context, and particularly when you're trying to decide what's the most valuable audience to target, you can identify that with demographic data. You can kind of say, okay, this is the audience that's moving in this direction already. So there's already some peer support. Maybe let's concentrate our efforts on this audience to move more people along within it. And then that will create an overall societal shift that shows the most evidence in that age range, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for that great overview of the kinds of surveys that are helpful for animal advocacy work and how we at the Vancouver Humane Society have commissioned quite a few surveys over the past 3 years, and we'd like to share a little bit about those and how they've been helpful for our work. So one example is the VHS commissioned a poll on plant-based eating habits and opinions among people in the Lower Mainland of BC in December 2022. You can hear a lot more about this poll in depth in our episode from July 2023, which is is called Will Plant-Based Become the Norm? So a lot of things came out of this. First of all, it informed our advocacy work by telling us people's biggest motivations for reducing their consumption of animal products. The results of that were the top motivator for people eating less meat and animal products was personal health, and then the cost of foods and the environment were tied, and then animal well-being came forth. We also collected data from this survey about people's eating habits. So that told us how many servings of various animal products people are actually eating each month. Like most people are eating 7 to 17 servings of eggs, but they're eating less than 4 servings of fish. So from that, we created an impact report that specifically looked at the impact an average person could make in the Lower Mainland, eating the average Lower Mainland diet by switching some or all of their diet from animal-based foods to plant-based. And that was in terms of both emissions and cost savings. So for instance, we found that by switching 100% of their diet to plant-based foods for 1 year, one person could save the amount of emissions it takes to power a home for 6 months, and they could also save about $600 a year. By switching just 25% of their diet, they could save the amount of carbon that's sequestered by a quarter acre of forested land, and they could also save about $156 a year. So we were able to share the findings from that survey and the report in a plant-based advocacy campaign, which included billboards across Vancouver, a series of videos on social media, and a press release that was covered in 23 media outlets. And we also continue to use the results from that survey to inform our plant-based advocacy work and to reach more people with accessible plant-based foods and, reasons to eat it. As we've mentioned before, the potential to change animals' lives through this kind of advocacy is massive. In 2023, 859 million land animals were killed for food in Canada. So if we can convince people who are eating animal products to switch even just 1 day a week to plant-based foods, we can save almost 123 million land animals every year, plus an estimate of more than 1.4 billion aquatic animals. And it would also make a huge difference in decreasing the demand for industrial animal agriculture, which shoves way more animals into a smaller space for greater output. It's what many people know as factory farming, and we know that's where many of the greatest harms to animals happen on an almost unimaginable scale.
And really, the nice thing about survey data is it takes really big concepts and you can condense them to a simple phrase and assess where people are at based on that phrase. So by the time you've narrowed that down, you can make that available to the public and they will likely sort of have a thought or an opinion on it. And when you present that information, it gets people thinking about themselves and their own habits.
Absolutely.
The VHS has also commissioned 3 surveys on the Calgary Stampede in the past 3 years. And so the very first survey that was conducted was in 2022. And it found that removing the rodeo and check wagons from the Calgary Stampede would have virtually no impact on attendance and would actually bring in some new crowds. And so essentially 64% of Calgarians had attended or planned to attend that year. And 63%, essentially almost the same number, said they would attend without the rodeo or check wagons. And then 24% of non-attendees from that year said that they would attend if the animal events were dropped. Bringing that forward to council helps them to see that there is a wider audience that could be reached by the Stampede. And that has a lot of effects on things like marketing. The Stampede is essentially a profit-driven entity in that they are looking to bring in money into the city, people going to stay at hotels, go to the music shows. And so if they can bring more people in and join the Stampede, they have incentive to do that for tourism purposes. There's also polls conducted in 2024, and we essentially conducted a poll before the Stampede, gauging support in Calgary, in Alberta, and across Canada. Then we monitored the Stampede and we shared information with the media about animal deaths and incidents, which turned out to be the deadliest year of animal events since 2019 with 4 deaths. That was really impactful, and we made sure to share that impact with the media. We also ran a campaign to raise awareness about the harms caused by rodeo and check wagon races online. The polling that we did after the Stampede showed a drop in support for all events amongst Canadians. A majority of the Calgarians Calgarians opposed one of the 5 events listed in the survey in February, but that jumped to 4 out of 5 in July. And then in both groups, there was an increase in opposition to government funding of rodeo events. And the increase was really sharp in Calgary, where opposition to funding rose from 51% all the way to 67%. So we got essentially from half the population to 2/3 of the population was opposed to the government funding these rodeo events. And certainly that speaks miles for people who are making decisions based on what voters think. And so these results were shared on social media and in an op-ed published in the Daily Hive, as well as with City Council in Calgary.
Yeah, that's really impactful. That's a huge shift in opinion.
Yeah. And the thing about it is that without this data, we would not know if our campaigns were effective. And it does cost some money, but the outcome has value. So it's not just an internal value, but there's that external value of sharing the information as well. I'll move on to talking about a captivity poll. So in 2022, we did a poll on public opinion about animals in captivity in BC. And the outcome was pretty remarkable. We found that 89% of British Columbians are opposed to the international trade of wild and exotic animals to be kept in permanent captivity in zoos and aquariums. This was shared in media stories in a letter to the province of British Columbia calling for changes to the Controlled Alien Species Act, which currently allows many exotic animals to be imported. It's amazing to think about all of the animals that are kept in captivity solely just for human entertainment, and that the general population is not on board with that. People were split fairly evenly on actually keeping animals in zoos and aquariums for entertainment and education. So there's 49% in favor and 44% were opposed. And that really helped us inform our outreach campaign, realizing that there is some thought to the education and entertainment value of animals in zoos. And while we understand that the amount of suffering animals experience doesn't balance out with the entertainment and education value, this is something that we need to shift public opinion on. And we can do another poll ahead to see if we've changed that once we've done another campaign. So it's really nice to benchmark those things over time and to see if we can shift public opinion and public purchasing decisions to match the knowledge that we have and the science that we have.
Yeah, I'm really interested to see the future of public opinion on this because I think there's a lot of messaging around zoos that they have a lot of educational value, but the evidence that we have shows that people don't learn more from going to see animals at a zoo than they would just learning about animals from home or going for a walk through the forest, you know? So I think that there's a lot of potential to help people learn about ways that they can become educated about animals and animal well-being without causing animals to suffer because they're sitting in a cage in captivity. I also wanted to talk about a survey from this year, which was a newer one. It's a poll of BC residents gauging people's general knowledge and interests around animal topics. And this survey is really interesting because it's going to be used to inform our work on a wider scale in the coming years to raise awareness on the care and well-being of animals and also to advocate for changes that will prevent animal suffering in public policy. So some key findings from that survey were most British Columbians, 56.4%, have at least one companion animal in their household. So that gives us a lot of potential to share information about animal care. And also, most British Columbians are interested in 5 of the topics that we asked about in our survey, which were one was recommendations around interacting with and protecting wildlife. One was welfare concerns around farmed animals. One was how to care for pets. So that includes things like grooming and food. One was welfare concerns around animals in captivity in zoos and aquariums. And one was how to train pets. And that's not necessarily just trick training. It's really things that influence the well-being of companion animals on a day-to-day basis. Like how can we desensitize an animal to the sound of fireworks that really stresses them out? Or how can we make it easier for them to go through care like grooming or to go on a positive experience of a walk outside? We also asked about people's dietary dietary preferences. So we found that 12% of people were flexitarian, 9% were vegetarian, and 2% were vegan. We asked about what actions folks have taken for animals in the past 6 months, and we found that almost half of people who were surveyed had taken at least one of the actions that we listed. The top ones were things like reading or watching news information about animals, donating to animal organizations, or signing petitions. And we also asked about which resources people consider useful when they're learning about a new topic. And the three sources that stood out there were on websites, on YouTube, and in TV news stories. So again, overall, that survey is going to help us understand current public behaviors around animal welfare and attitudes around animal well-being. It'll help us determine the most popular topics surrounding animal well-being and advocacy so that we can share information about those. And it will also determine the most effective platforms where we can reach people regarding animal topics.
Yeah, those are all so important when it comes to making decisions about advocacy. I wanted to share a little bit about also some of the qualitative studies that we've done and some non-public polling. We've partnered with research institutions to do interviews with people who accessed care for their pets in the time of an emergency, specifically post-COVID. So we looked at sort of the financial impacts of COVID on people who had pets and were low income. Another survey or study that we did was looking at people who work in the trauma-informed sector and getting a sense of how they operate and how they essentially like support workers who work in that sector and what their attitudes are towards burnout. And then we also interviewed people who work in the shelter sector, in the animal enforcement sector, and leadership in those, and looked at what the differences were, and then put together a report using a literature review and those surveys that ended up informing a training program. And the training program is free for anyone to take online to look at how to make the work that they do more trauma informed. And so in that way, we're advocating across our own sector for more trauma informed care of people, which we know will have a positive impact on the animals that people care for. So even though it's not a quick study, it takes longer, the sort of depth of that allows for a much more thorough understanding of the sector and what was needed for how we could create some pretty significant shifts within our own community, our own sector. We also did a cost benefit analysis that was completely using financial data around products and looked at municipal purchasing to assess how we could improve the systems where municipalities are purchasing food. So are there cheaper products that they could replace one for another? That could be as simple as replacing dairy milk with oat milk. And it could mean replacing beans and lentils and having those instead of having beef products. The financial benefit of that is huge. And so if we're looking at kind of like a public body that's accountable to citizens for being financially responsible, we can demonstrate that plant-based products do make a significant impact when it comes to the waste stream, the impact on the environment, and the financial choices. So those types of studies, maybe it's qualitative research, maybe it's a more like an economic analysis, can also have a huge impact when it comes to changing policies.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the major themes I'm noticing as you're speaking is there's lots of different avenues to advocate for a better world for animals. People are not always going to listen to concerns about animal well-being and their experiences on the day-to-day. That doesn't always make an impact with policymakers. But talking about the financial impacts, the environmental impacts, we've also talked, I think briefly on this show, about the concept of one health, one welfare. So that's the interconnectedness of the well-being of humans and animals and the environment. So when we look at any one of those things, they all impact each other. And for instance, creating more trauma-informed services for people with their companion animals has a really positive impact on the actual lives of those companion animals as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so important important to make sure with surveys we're getting accurate data that's as unbiased as possible in terms of how we're asking the questions. Obviously, we know people themselves are biased, and that's the whole point. But when we use this information to speak with decision makers, we want those to be well-informed recommendations and make sure we're also sharing accurate information with the public. So when we're conducting surveys about public opinion on behavior, we use legitimate and reputable survey companies like ResearchCo and Angus Reid Institute to help with that. And when we're working with public institutions like universities, we're making sure that the process is going through an entire kind of evaluation within the university that meets their standards.
Yeah, absolutely. We really want this data to be accurate and to be truthful. So that's so important. And you can find more information about all of these surveys that we've talked about on our website. We'll link to all of them in a blog post that accompanies this episode, which you can find at vancouverhumane.ca/podcasts. And we hope you found this information helpful and interesting. This is our last episode of the year, so thank you so much for joining us on this journey. We have lots of exciting things coming in the new year, like a look back at the past year of progress and challenges in the animal protection sector. So we hope you'll join us again for that. And Happy New Year.
Looking forward to it. Happy New Year, everyone.
The Informed Animal Ally is a podcast by the Vancouver Humane Society. If you found this episode helpful, please consider giving us a 5-star rating and review to help us reach more supporters of animals. To support this project and other initiatives to build a kinder world for animals, you can make a donation at vancouverhumane.ca. You can also follow the Vancouver Humane Society on Facebook at Vancouver Humane Society, Instagram at Vancouver Humane, or Twitter at VanHumane. The music in this episode is the song Jonah's Message for New York by Dr. Turtle, licensed under the Creative Commons Attribution 4.0 International Public License. Thank you for listening, and thank you for being an animal ally.